Okay then, so the first request we need to make is to the locations API to get information about a particular city. So, for example, Manchester or London or New York. And then this request is going to send information about that city back to us in the browser. And as part of that information, we're going to get a location key code. That is a key code that represents that location in the AccuWeather API. Now, the next request after that is going to be for the current conditions in that area. And when we make that request, we're going to need that key code for that area as we make it, so that it sends us back the weather for that area. So we need to make this one first to get the key code, then use the key code to make the next one. So then let's go to the locations API, and the endpoint we want is down here, city search. So this right here, this is the resource URL, or the endpoint URL if you like. It's the base of the URL, but we also need to add on query parameters to the end. The first query parameter that's required is the API key, so that's this thing over here. And in fact, I'm just going to copy that. And this here, this is the query that we want to make, the city that we're looking for in essence. So I'm going to paste this in here, the API key, and then I'm going to look for the city Manchester. Now we don't have to fill in any of the other parameters. This here, this is an online test to see what we'd get back if we made this kind of query from our code. So let's just send this request and see what we get back. So if we scroll down, we can see on the response tab here, this is the response, and this is all the data we would get back, which is a load of information about that location. Now somewhere inside this information there is a key property right here in fact, and this is the key that we need to make the next request to the current conditions weather API. When we send that, it sends us back weather for this area. So this is ultimately what we need. So what we're going to do now is make this request from our code. So let's first of all make a function which is going to do all of this requesting. We'll call it getCity and set this equal to an async function. Now it's async because we're going to make requests in here and we want this to return a promise. So inside here, the first thing I want to do before I make any request is make a constant called base and set that equal to something. It's going to be a string and it's going to be this thing right here. So let me copy that and paste it in here. This is the base URL of the API endpoint that we want to make a request to. Now remember, we also need the query parameter stuff on the end, and we're going to store that in a separate const, and then we'll combine them together later. So we'll call this query and set it equal to some kind of string. Now when we're adding query parameters to the end of a string, the first thing we do is a question mark. So whenever you see question marks up here at the end of something like that, it means we're adding query parameters to the end of that URL. Now the first query parameter we need to add is called API key. So we say API key is equal to something or other. Now we need to set it equal to the key that we have right here. So I could just grab that and paste it here, but instead I'm going to turn this into a template string instead of a normal string. Then we can just embed this variable. So I'll do that by doing $, curly braces, and then the key constant. So now we have the first query parameter. The next query parameter is this one right here, Q. Now when we're adding another query parameter, first thing we need to do is an ampersand to say, okay, now it's the next query parameter. That one is called Q and it's equal to something or other. Now it's going to be equal to something like Manchester or London or New York or something. Now we don't want to hard code that here because that means that every time we call this function, it's going to be the same city that we're looking for. Instead, what we want to do is take the city as a parameter to this function. So when we invoke it, we pass it as an argument, and then we can output it here as a variable. So we'll take the city and put it there. So now we have our query parameters in a string, and we have our base URL to the endpoint in a string. Now we need to combine them together and fetch that resource. So the way we're going to do this is by saying const response is equal to await, because we're going to wait right here until this promise is resolved. Then we'll use fetch, and we want to fetch the resource of this and this combined. Now to do that, we can just concatenate these two things by adding a plus sign between them. So we'll say base plus query, like so. So that's going to tack these two together, place it inside here as a single argument, and then it's going to fetch that resource. This returns a promise. It's going to resolve that promise and pass that response to this constant right here. So remember, when we get a response using the fetch API, what we need to do is turn that into data using the JSON method. So we can say const data is now equal to await, because the JSON method returns a promise again, and we want the response, which we get right here, and then we want to use the JSON method on that. So now this promise resolves and hands the resolved data to this variable right here, and then what we're going to do for now is just console.log the data. So now we need to call this method right here. Now what I'm going to do is say get city like so, and I'm going to pass in a city because we expect one. So I'll pass it in as a string, and we'll just do Manchester. Now we're not returning anything yet, so we don't need to tack on a .then method to do something after we've done this. All we're doing is logging the data, and we'll do the then method later on. So let me just save this, and let's preview over in the browser. So F12 to open up your console, and notice we have some kind of error. So what I'm going to do is just make sure everything's correct. Okay, so I've just noticed here, this is actually not a capital K, and we did that with a capital K. So let's just delete that capital, place a lowercase k, save this, and let's try this again. I hope it works. Okay, so this time it works. So just a schoolboy error. I don't know what I was doing there. But anyway, API key with all lowercase letters. Now this works. So then, now we can see all of this logged to the console, and this is all the data that we get back. Now, we asked for a single city, right? And the first element in this is the city called Manchester. So it responds with a few different cities, and it responds with all these cities based on how much they match what we've searched for. So the top one is going to be the closest matched. This one down here, we can see this is in the United States, Manchester. So what I'm going to do is just take the first element from this. So this is an array. We're going to take the first position of this, and that is the closest match. So that will just get us the first element, which is this object right here, and this is the one we want, the closest match. So now, instead of just logging that to the console, what we could do is return this data. So this will return this single object, but obviously because this is an asynchronous function, this returns a promise. So because this now is returning a promise, what we do is tack on the .then method, and we take the data that it returns us when that promise resolves, which is this thing right here. So all I'm going to do with that is log it to the console, console.log data that we get back, and we'll also tack on a catch method in case there's any errors. So catch, and then we'll say error, and we'll pass that into a function, and we'll just console.log the error itself. Okay, so let's give this a whirl now. Hopefully there's no errors, and we just get the data logged right here. Save it, and we can see that one object right here. And now if we open this up, we get all the information about the area, but we also get this key right here, and that is crucial. That is the information we need to make the second request to get the current conditions, or the weather if you like, from this location, and we'll do that in the next lecture.